Humanities Center. I also want to thank the audience in advance for their careful consideration of my comments today. All right, here we go. I originally planned to summarize forthcoming paper, but when I sat down to prepare for today, I became horribly bored. So if you want to see that work, it's coming to an issue near you. It makes what I think are two important points. First, that it follows scholarship, indicating cities like New York were able to hold on to some manufacturing because of immigrant labor. I argue the same happens for urban space that is forgotten and reclaimed, thus the title of today's talk. In the paper, I also talk about how the commons is scaled from the local to the global. Today, I want to move forward with thinking on a new project on the commons, which seems to be the latest floating signifier darling. For instance, here it's unclear if the STEM Commons is a building, a physical space. Its webpage indicates things the commons will do, but the actor is undefined. Sociologists have used the commons in a variety of ways, as have scholars across the social sciences and the humanities, for instance, to refer to things as diverse as publicly owned resources, collective and local, ownership in opposition to private property, or an ambiguously defined community. As an action, the commons has been used to refer to community building. For some scholars, the commons is a source of tragedy, occasioned by self-interested action that undermines an undefined common good. Other scholars point instead to a process, an observable relationship built in space over time between the self and its experience of the social. I consider this last use to be the most fruitful for sociological analysis. My objective today is to draw upon the various dimensions of how the commons has been used in order to develop conceptual and theoretical clarity around the term. This means I want to make the commons amenable to a more focused analysis using these 3 units of observation. Sorry, out of order. The action, a recordable moment in time, the process, repeated actions over time and in physical space, and things that are artifacts of socio-cultural production shaped in relation to and beyond structural constraints. So that's very important. So you can go back to the other slide. So in my comments today, I want to accomplish 3 things. First, I'm going to outline what I consider a useful working definition of the commons. Second, I'm going to outline my case. Oh, it's too bad. Okay. A once abandoned factory that has been continuously occupied by urban denizens for the past 10 years. Residents repurposed the factory to accommodate not only their families, but also a museum, an occupied museum. This is the promise of design. When used to identify alternatives, we can expand the common. My intention is to move my analytic lens eventually toward Detroit, where what some people refer to as squatters is part of a collective action that implicates more than 10% of the land bank. So I think it's important, right, the scaling between the factory and the individual home. Worthy of note, perhaps, is that squatters are considered more numerous in Detroit than any other U.S. city. My project on American Dreams, Latino Realities, finds important evidence of what city residents call intentional squatting. And it's important to not conflate homelessness with political action. So finally, I'm going to focus on these 3 units of observation to consider the commons a new space for politics, action, process, and thing. Hopefully we can use the question and answer period to elaborate upon what I believe are critical lessons for Detroit and design-based development. Okay. So the question of the commons is critical because globalization, media saturation, population growth, the critical state of the natural environment changed the relationship between the individual and the community. And philosophers have wrangled with developing an alternate meaning of community, a community to come, for at least the past 40 years, right? Heidegger, Derrida, Gambin, Rorty, Habermas. The search for the real utopia was the theme of the 2012 ASA, which I think is a coincidence worth mentioning, right? Because the president of the ASA that year was Eric Hollenreich, who's recently passed. And so I think this speaks to the enduring importance of this question. At least for sociologists, this liminal space between the individual and the collective, between the self and the experience of the world, between the self and the other, is not only our question, but the question of the commons. So I reviewed many definitions and applications over the past year of the commons and was almost deafened by the noise of imprecision. I found the most analytically fruitful to be its treatment by Michael Hart and Antonio Negri in their 2009 text, Commonwealth. Hart and Negri make many important arguments in their text, but one way of summarizing what's at stake and how they define the commons is aptly summarized by Zizek, where he argues. Their definition draws attention to the destructive potentials up to the self-annihilation of humanity itself if the capitalist logic of enclosing the commons is allowed free rein. It's this reference to the commons which justifies the resuscitation of the notion of commons. Indeed, Hart and Negri make a similar and incisive claim when they define their support for the project of alter-modernity. They write, alter-modernity gives us a preliminary way to distinguish socialism and communism, where socialism ambivalently straddles modernity and anti-modernity. Communism must break both of these by presenting a direct relation to the common to develop the paths of alter-modernity. So what is this direct relation? I'm going to work my way backwards to outline only those aspects of their argument that bear directly on my analysis. And their first task is to distinguish alter-modernity from modernity and anti-modernity. They do this in a couple of ways, but I have a particular affinity for how they engage Horkheimer and Adorno, and I thought my students would be in the audience and I would bring the conversation this way. But they titled their section, Caliban Breaks Free of the Dialectic, to critique how Horkheimer and Adorno bring the monsters of anti-modernity, rationalism, myth, domination, and barbarism, into dialectical relation with enlightenment. In this analysis, modernity is inextricably caught in an intimate relationship with its opposite. One example, Nazis is a symptom of the nature of modernity, but Hart and Negri use this critical case to point out two problems with how Horkheimer and Adorno understand anti-modernity. First, Hart and Negri argue Horkheimer and Adorno homogenize the forces of anti-modernity, ignoring forces that are not liberatory, including other efforts at ethnic cleansing, white supremacy, the KKK, and U.S. neoconservatives' fantasy of global dominance. Hart and Negri consider these anti-modern elements are an effort to break the relation at the heart of modernity and free the dominator from dealing with the subordinated. But they point out it's an illusion, right? Because rulers can't survive without ruled. Just like capitalists can't survive without those pesky workers. The second problem with how Horkheimer and Adorno treat the forces of anti-modernity is that they remain closed in a dialectic, limiting anti-modernities to opposing, contradicting modernity. Rather than movement, then, the dialectic brings this relationship to a standstill. This is critical to my analysis. Everything that I've been thinking about this year regarding mobility, world on the move, proliferation of borders. So I've drawn mercilessly here on Hart and Negri's own words, but I'm certain I can't do justice to their analysis of the monster that Caliban rescued from Shakespeare's writing in The Tempest by Émile Césaire. Their reading not only asserts autonomy for Afro-Caribbean thought and its independence from the European canon, but it also underscores that resistance and freedom always exceed the relationship of domination and cannot be contained in by a modern dialectic. Hart and Negri draw on other literature to indicate the ways the monster for the colonizer represents racism and fear of otherness, rereading, for instance. How Spinoza's monster is a real material force. It's the power of imagination, or the monstrous power of transformation that opens a field of possibility, in which we recognize what is common between one body and another, or an idea and another. I use this monstrous, an anti-dialectical point of departure to read the commons. Here, alter-modernity is based on the common as a new space for politics, open to the access of all and developed through active participation. This is the importance of my case and bears repeating. Alter-modernity is based on the common as a new space for politics, open to the access of all and developed through active participation. Whereas the common is difficult to see because neoliberal government policies have sought to privatize it Winning back and expanding the commons requires retraining our vision to create new alternatives explicitly aimed at ensuring resources will not be privatized, including those basic to human survival, such as water and electricity. The broader implications of my case includes housing this collective demand, which runs counter to the Republic of Property. I'm sure this is a tall order in the United States. Yeah. Here we go, folks. Hart and Negri remind us that the standard view is that the only alternative to the private is the public, which is managed and regulated by states and other governmental authorities. Related to this, the standard view is the equally pernicious political alternative presented between capitalism and socialism. Here I'll remind the audience that the relation to the common runs counter to the regime's property. My findings indicate we must reclaim how we live our lives collectively beyond the state and capital. Finally, I draw from Hart and Negri their attention to common organizational structures, which are social products and inexhaustible sources of innovation and creativity. In other words, the common is a collective, and my data suggests a daily practice, which is both the basis and the goal of struggles to create alternate social realities. In their words, the common is in the paradoxical position of being a ground or presupposition that is also the result of the process. Our analysis should not be aimed at being common then, but making it common. It's with these arguments in mind, and the intention to analyze the possibility of what Walter Benjamin called the barbaric productivity of the poor, that I now turn to my second objective, outlining my case. It's important the audience clearly distinguish Metropoliz, an occupied factory, from the Museum of Other and Elsewhere that is housed within the factory's walls. Metropoliz was occupied in 2009 by 200 immigrants, occasional workers, and homeless families. They cut the locks on the main gate and entered into a space that had been disoccupied since 1985. When I asked what the first night was like, I had one resident ask me pointedly whether I can imagine what it's like to face living in a place that had been disoccupied for 20 years. There's no water, no electricity. So I just couldn't. The experiment that is Metropoliz, as one resident referred to it, is unlike the approximately 100 other occupations in Rome. Never mind, it included in Italy's Lotta per la Casa, which roughly translates to the country's right to housing movement. I say roughly because obviously fight for a home is a much closer approximation of how people experience the struggle in this way. The conditions causing Rome's housing crisis will sound eerily familiar to any Detroit resident, and I do a much better job discussing it in the forthcoming paper. But in a paragraph that got cut from the final version, I discuss changes in housing policies and markets, as well as rising unemployment. Rome's rental market was deregulated in the 1990s, and public housing was privatized. The country's banking system faced bad debts, 40% of which resulted from real estate and construction bankruptcies. As a result, there were fewer housing units available, and rising unemployment encouraged an ever-increasing number of evictions. The number of court-approved evictions increased by over 56% since 2003, and in 2015, for instance, approximately 3,030 people were carried out, evictions were carried out in the city. At the same time, 41,000 residential buildings were vacant. Combined with precarious work for local youth and inadequate housing for migrants, by 2016, 6,000 to 7,000 people lived in about 50 buildings taken by collective squatting actions. And of course, that number has increased to over 100 by now, but there's a continual struggle between occupations and evictions. So it's really very ugly to watch these evictions, and actually not just in Rome, but here in Detroit too, where the city's most vulnerable populations are kicked out of homes they once built a life in. A variety of conversations with scholars and activists indicates consensus that, in Rome's case, blocchi precari metropolitani, or BPM, is the major player. The status is not only about the properties BPM occupied, but perhaps of greater consequence, how long squatters have held continuous residence in them. There are many housing arrangements that result from the privatization of housing markets, including a decision by the state to stop building new public housing. There's a development of social centers, and the development of refugee and other types of informal camps across Italy. At stake in this precarity is not only very real life and death consequences, But they also implicate a variety of political debates. BPM seems almost entirely focused on right to the city and a vision that most closely aligns with David Harvey's analysis. Margarita Grazioli is a political scientist who wrote her dissertation based on data collected from 2 BPM occupations, and her analysis emphasizes urban social reproduction. But I think the audience is well served to focus on Metropoliz's residents who are clearly focused on their precarity, manifest in the issue of security. Article 5 of the law passed May 14 recurs in my interviews. It effectively ended the possibility that claims for refugee status could use illegal occupations as a residence. But the problem of claims of legal existence have only intensified since then, because now it appears landlords have to physically accompany individuals through the infamously ineffective bureaucratic machinery that would grant status, effectively turning over designations of legal status to the hands of the capitalists. There are other significant legal and political changes that redefine how Italian courts value capitalist claims over people seeking a right to existence vis-a-vis housing. What was once the Fiorucci salami factory, well ensconced in an area of the city with organized workers, is now owned by the Salini family. But everyone in Metropoliz refers to Pietro Salini. He's behind the court cases that claim Italy owes him 28 million euros for lost income on the property, while his company wins multi-million-dollar contracts across 50 countries, including, for instance, a $955 million contract. It would seem BPM's only option is to pay lawyers to keep postponing the case, but even Paulo, one of the 2 main activists, has had to serve time in prison for cutting locks. By now, Metropoliz residents are overwhelmingly refugees, and they see Paulo sticking his neck out for them. So how to be a good social scientist and measure Pardon Nevy's depiction of common organizational structures as social products that are inexhaustible sources of innovation and creativity? How to identify alternative social relations with an analytic frame already profoundly imbricated in modern science? Here I consider process perhaps the best unit of observation that exists between discrete actions and observable things or artifacts of that process. Beginning at the smallest unit of observation, Metropoliz indicates 2 important forms of action: occupation and political acts that are understood as political. Once BPM helps people occupy a property, there soon their role becomes secondary. It's worth noting that scholars estimate BPM occupations are enabled by a population that is made up of at least 80% of persons who are not Italians. This leaves a multi-ethnic, multilingual population of occupants to figure out how to live together on a daily basis. These actions are definitive of autonomous action that is only partly influenced by the logics of capitalist state control. In the case of Metropoliz, that left residents to figure out how they would occupy a derelict factory and how they would defend themselves from eviction. Part of the ongoing, seemingly daily adaptations to a continually changing structural content mean engaging in at least 4 types of political action. 1, demonstrations at the city level that included a 4-day occupation of the city center in 2015, and plenty of physical altercations between police and protesters. Ongoing court cases and imprisonment represented not only by Paulo's sentence, but at least the penalization of 1 other resident's actions for commanding access to electricity. It was 1 year. Use of existing social relationships to obtain documents to enable successful occupation, including the factory plan, identifying the drainage system beneath the factory's floor, so they could tap into it for drainage. And finally, an almost unanimous theme cutting across 23 interviews that talked about outsiders taking advantage. And this is not just physical, financial advantage. It's instead referring to subordinating residents' actions to market logic. In terms of process, which is perhaps the greatest source of my analytic interest, I identified another 3 phenomena that are repeated across time and individual placemaking, making the homes. There are, of course, the way residents share their labor, bartering skill sets in order to create individual units. I repeatedly queried residents about why the degree of investment in an uncertain outcome, right? They could be evicted at any time. Why invest time, energy, money? The response consistently seemed to be of the nature that it happened little by little. When I had some money, I bought some bricks. and so on and so forth. The bargaining of skill sets included exchanging money for work, but here what I think is really important is that residents felt paying other residents for work was a way of helping each other out. Time and time again, my respondents spoke in terms that underscored how the exchange was understood by both parties to be beyond market logic and was instead based on sharing resources. There are often forms of social organization that will certainly fascinate all of us here. It's fascinating me, but I have limited time, so I'm going to simply refer to monthly assemblies, and sometimes they're more frequent, as needed, where grievances are aired and priorities established. And there are also important forms of alternate gender arrangements within seemingly traditional family units. But I want to take a minute to explore the cost of the commons as it was understood by BPM and a resident. In a meeting I had with the key BPM leaders, there are two, I insisted a Peruvian resident, Sarah, sit with us. During the evenings and on Saturdays when the museum is open to visitors, she's generally busy cleaning and cooking in the museum's common kitchen. She's the back of the house, as restaurant organizers call it. No doubt that Italian museum visitors engage with residents, but the terms of this engagement are problematic and unfortunately beyond the scope of my comments today. Suffice it to say that I could clearly recall how day laborers felt tourists came on school buses to look at them as if they were, as one day laborer claimed, animals in a zoo. In this context, I tried to explain to the BPM activists how I saw the residents' labor as uncompensated, and at least in some sense, perhaps stolen. I outlined my observations of how residents were background color for the museum. I explained how Sarah and her neighbors seemed invisible when the occupied museum would not exist if not for their daily experience of insecurity and precarity. Ironically, the BPM activists couldn't understand this. Perhaps they had a hard time considering her labor. Maybe some things don't translate well to Italian. Or maybe my analysis was wrong. I discussed a party with famous, that was attended by famous artists, activists, supporters, and residents. There must have been 100 people in the room. Meanwhile, Sarah was leading a group of 4 residents who should have been enjoying their work for this 10-year anniversary celebration of the occupation. After all, the ongoing experiment would not have been successful if not for their work. Instead, here they were at 10 p.m., cooking, cleaning, back and forth in the common area and the kitchen. She had to work the next morning at 3 o'clock in the morning. So I explained I was having a hard time reconciling my observation. She started to cry. She said, I didn't understand that they have to make themselves available when people come. This is when I understood the extra economic logic of the demand for housing. Beautiful. And the ongoing cost in terms of what I saw as perpetual uncompensated labor. And what she saw as a basic human need to put a roof over her children's heads. I'm really sorry. It's worth mentioning that, given the choice, she and other residents would not leave Metropoliz for alternate housing. This is her home. It's moments like this, like these, that make clear there's a lot more involved in these ongoing collective practices to create alternative social relations. It's funny because I didn't talk about this, but part of Ned, we also talk about love, right? Love and poverty. So maybe this is the consequence of that. Anyway, that in fact do run counter to the regimes of property that exclude the common. Over barbecue days later, both Sarah and her husband talk about how they often fantasize about giving up and going back to their country. This echoes how other residents talk about not having a secure place to exist, and the desire for an alternative, like the Roma, who is nostalgic about the good thing about communist Romania was that everybody owned land. But then he goes on to this other things that he likes and misses, like everyone had a job. This is perhaps one of the greatest lessons that Metropoliz prepared offered me that I want to think more about. Finally, to identify some evidence of the comments, I want to focus on things or artifacts that speak to these alternate social relations. So what I love were the barbecue grills. I don't know if you can tell. This is the drum of a washing machine. This is the other drum, and this is the ring that would go inside. You lift off this grill in the sink, and that's where you would put the the charcoal, so you could grill. Yeah. And what I think is interesting is that this is really coming from collective living, right? You see here the steel drum cut in half to allow the air to come out, and it's being held by the shopping cart. I think that's better than the art of the museum, I must say. And front, I thought this was very, very important. All of the, that's not true, some of the row homes, because they're dedicated to recycling, they actually had ovens. But other people basically created stoves. This is a water boiler. And so I guess what they do is they make holes in the bottom. I don't know if you can tell. This is where the air is coming through. And then this is a cut in the wheel. Is that what it's called? So they could access it. Wheel rim, thank you. So they, when Roma explained that he learned how to make them in Romania because under the communist administration, they had to heat them. Okay, make sense? And I'm not going to talk too much about Detroit unintentional squatting, but it's important to recognize that that's an issue in Detroit. Done. Thank you.